Hello, my name is Kayla Dawson, and this is Benchmark Lab 5. The purpose of this lab was to perform a penetration test of the Metasploitable 2 virtual machine. Using vulnerability scanner tools such as Nmap, NICTO, OWASP Z-Attack Proxy, and Nessus, I was able to create a risk assessment, gap analysis, and perform 3 different system hardening techniques to apply patches to medium and high vulnerabilities within the system. Before I got started and I did any type of active testing, I planned and organized how I would perform this test. So the first step was setting both Kali Linux and Metasploitable 2 to network adapter type host only. That way the Kali machine is able to communicate with the Metasploitable 2 machine. After configuring both virtual machines on the same network, I would start the Kali machine first, log into the system. After it's finished booting up, then I would start the Metasploitable 2 machine, log into the system, and run command ifconfig to identify the IP address and active interfaces running on the machine. And that's what these two screenshots show here. On the left-hand side, me logging into Metasploitable. It's an intentionally vulnerable virtual machine, so the login was the same as the password, which was MSF admin. So once I got the IP address of the Metasploitable 2 machine, I switched back to my Kali machine, ran ifconfig to see if the Metasploitable 2 machine is communicating with the Kali machine. So if it is, I will move forward with running the vulnerability scans using Nmap, NICTO, OAuth, Z-Attack Proxy, all that good stuff. If not, I'll check to see if there's a network connectivity issue on my host machine, check if more than one network adapter is enabled because that could interfere, and then I would just start again from the second step of starting up Kali, then Metasploitable 2. So those are my ways of handling failures in the event that all 3 steps didn't go as smoothly. And just to double back, when I say communicating with Metasploitable to Kali, that means if both IP addresses for Kali and Metasploitable 2 are on the same subnet. So in this case, 192.168.3313 for Metasploitable 2 and 192.168.33.114 for Kali, then the 2 virtual machines are connected, which you'll see later in the presentation. All right, so the purpose of a penetration test is to identify, test, and highlight vulnerabilities in an organization's IT infrastructure. And what penetration test does is they provide an attacker's perspective on an organization's security. And in this case, the purpose of me conducting a penetration test on Metasploitable 2 is to see not only what vulnerabilities exist within the system, but where I can apply fixes as far as system hardening to make the system less vulnerable. So still in the beginning stage of this penetration test, I'm gathering some information as far as what IP address is running on Kali, and we see that it's running on the same subnet as Metasploitable 2. From the previous slide, we saw that Metasploitable has the IP address of 192.168.33.113, and Kali has the IP address of 192.168.33.114. So we see that they're on the same subnet, they can communicate, and once we conduct vulnerability scans, they should run smoothly. After running Nmap, I see here that there are a slew of services running on Metasploitable 2, but all of them are open. So every service is open. We get what port they're running on. And what's interesting is at the very end of that list is an unknown service running on port 8180. And on this right-hand side, ran NICTO, and NICTO is a built-in vulnerability scanner within Linux systems. And what we get here is the server information. So we see that it's running Apache, and we also see that that's a vulnerability because the version of Apache that's running is outdated. We see here that HTTP trace method is active, so it's vulnerable to cross-site tracing. We see that certain directories are browsable. Folders that hold credentials are not protected and can be easily accessible by users. We also see that the anti-clickjacking X-frame options header and the X-content type options header aren't present, nor are they set. So this allows a user to basically manipulate the content of the site in a different fashion to the MIME type. And we also see that with anti-clickjacking X-frame options header not being present, it is subject to a cross-site scripting attack. All right, so in my first scan using my first vulnerability scan using Nessus, we see the policy information and we see the severity base. But most importantly, we see what vulnerabilities are critical based on their severity and which ones are just informational, doesn't pose any serious threats, and which ones are kind of in the middle. So at the very top of the list, the most severe vulnerability is CGI generic remote file inclusion. This allows a threat actor to remotely include a file and allow them to carry out arbitrary commands. We see that the Apache Tomcat has some issues. PHP MyAdmin has some issues. PHP has multiple issues. So just doubling back to the last slide where a file of credentials, PHP MyInfo, that contained credentials to the Metasploitable 2 machine. And then we see some more CGI vulnerabilities, CGI generic local file inclusion, backup files disclosure, browsable web directories, CGI generic path traversal, web application information disclosure, web application potentially vulnerable to clickjacking. So that's two different scanners that picked up clickjacking. We see CGI generic cookie injection scripting, CGI generic HTML injections, CGI generic cross-site scripting, the Tomcat sample app cal2, JSP time parameter, cross-site scripting, and we also see the family it falls under. And before I read through the rest of the list, most of these vulnerabilities fall under the family of either CGI abuses or CGI abuses, cross-site scripting, or web servers. And just to continue down the list, we see multiple issues with HTTP, multiple issues with PHP, PHP MyAdmin, web server, and HTTP. So that's most of the vulnerabilities, not all, but the more important ones that Nessus picked up. And right here on this right hand side, we got OWASP Z attack proxy, and it picked up in total 20 vulnerabilities as far as what those alerts indicate. And at the very top, we see the most critical with the red flag, path traversal. There's about 12 of those. Absence of anti-cross-site request forgery tokens. It's a lot of those. Actually, that's the most in this list of 6,152. Application error disclosure, content security policy header not set, directory browsing, missing anti-clicking header, vulnerable JavaScript library, and then we just got some low vulnerabilities, so cookie no HTTP only flag, some more cookie issues, private IP disclosure, information disclosure as far as debug error messages, and timestamp disclosure. We also see X content type options header is missing, so NICTO also picked that up. And then just in the rest of the list, we see a couple of informational alerts as far as information disclosure in the URL, suspicious comments, user controllable character set, and potential cross-site scripting with user controllable HTML element attribute, and some modern web application misconfigurations. But once again, the blue flags, those aren't as serious. Those are just informational, just letting you know that, hey, those exist. Um, they don't pose too much of a serious threat, but they could they could be used in an advanced exploit. So here's a risk assessment of the top 3 vulnerabilities that Nikto, Nessus, and OWASP Z attack proxy picked up in its vulnerability scans. At the very top is CGI remote file inclusion. The Mutility application is vulnerable to an attacker running malicious code on the web server. It has a severity and risk level of high. The best way to prevent this vulnerability from being exploited is to restrict access to Mutility or update it to its newest version. Secondly is Mutility index PHP page and the PHP MyAdmin page are both vulnerable to clickjacking. And an attacker can trick a user into clicking an area of the vulnerable pages that is different from what the user perceives the page to be. So even though the vulnerability name is vulnerable to clickjacking, there's also an element of it being potentially subject to cross-site scripting. So the best way to mitigate both of these vulnerabilities is to return the X-frame options or content security policy HTTP header with the page's response. And lastly is Apache Tomcat web server security end of life is outdated. Its end of life was August 10, 2011, and the threat that comes with this vulnerability is there's a lack of security patches available. Nessus dubbed this as a high severity, high risk vulnerability. The best way to prevent this exploit is to uninstall Apache Tomcat or upgrade it to a supported version. All right, so shown in this table here is a gap analysis of the Metasploitable 2 virtual machine. Right now, its current state is an outdated version of Apache Tomcat, lack of X-frame options and content security policy headers, and lack of sanitization of request strings. In order for this machine to be less vulnerable than it is, an updated version of Apache Tomcat needs to be installed. There needs to be a X-frame options response header and content security policy frame ancestors response header in all content responses. And lastly, there needs to be a permission set that restrict access to Mutility pages. There is a gap in all 3 states. As far as Apache Tomcat, there needs to be an upgrade to the newest version available. If an upgrade isn't possible, remove the application off the machine. Same for X-frame options and content security policy headers. Those 2 need to be set in order for cross-site scripting and clickjacking to no longer be a vulnerability. And lastly, access to Mutility needs to be restricted as there's a lack of sanitization of request strings. So these 3 are based off of the vulnerabilities that were identified in the risk assessment and also based off of the results and details of the Nessus and OWASP Z attack proxy scans. Here is 3 different screenshots of hardening techniques of the Metasploitable 2 virtual machine. In the top left corner, we have PHP switch V, and what that does is output the version of PHP that's running on the machine. Right now, we see that the upgrade went through, and it is now updated to a version of PHP MyAdmin that's 4.8.6 or later. As we see here is 5.2.4. In the bottom left is the removal of Tomcat, as the 2 options for the outdated version of Tomcat that was running on the machine was to either upgrade it to the newest version available or just to remove it altogether. I found it a bit more simpler to just remove it. And over in the right hand corner is UFW enable, and what that did was just start the firewall, as there are certain ports that shouldn't be running just based off of that Nmap scan report. There's a lot of open ports and services that are running, and with this firewall, hopefully in the rerun of Nessus, some of those ports are closed. So unfortunately, I can't show the scan of the Nessus vulnerability scan of Metasploitable 2, as the Nessus / temporary directory is full, and it's not allowing me to run any more scans until some of that memory is cleared. I've been troubleshooting this issue for a couple of days now, and it hasn't been working. So unfortunately, I don't have the Nessus rescan to show the system hardening techniques. However, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I worked really hard on it, and hopefully down the line I can fix this issue before the final submission for the benchmark assessment that's due at the end of this program.